The night of July 24-25, 1943, Stade Fighter Control Station, Germany. Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann, a Luftwaffe radar operator, squinted at his screen, the cathode ray tube suddenly overwhelmed by a blizzard of green light. The console, moments ago a clean map of the night sky, was now flooded, not with dozens of signals, but thousands of unidentified aircraft echoes, all moving slowly, steadily, toward Hamburg. "This cannot be real," Hartmann reported, his voice tight. "My training says this is equipment failure. My instinct says we are witnessing a new form of warfare." Failure was the only logical conclusion. The Kammhuber Line, the intricate German air defense system Hartmann served, was considered the most advanced in the world, a wall of interlocking radar and searchlights that routinely achieved an interception rate of nearly 16% against Allied bombers. It was impenetrable. What Oberfunker Hartmann didn't know, what the entire Luftwaffe command structure could not comprehend, was that this was not equipment failure, it was the first mass deployment of Window. After 18 agonizing months of intense Allied debate, paralyzed by the fear the Germans would copy the technology, the decision had finally been made. The 791 RAF bombers approaching Hamburg were not alone. They were dropping millions of tiny aluminum-coated paper strips, each cut to the precise length to resonate with German radar, creating thousands of false echoes. The result was not confusion. It was the immediate and total neutralization of the German radar defense belt. The mathematics of the attack were staggering. The typical RAF loss rate of 5 to 6% plummeted to just 1.5%. A 75% reduction in a single night. This story is about a simple piece of aluminum foil, the symmetrical fear that delayed its use, and the night electronic warfare paralyzed a nation. The concept, known as chaff to the Americans and Düppel to the Germans, was simple, but its implications were so profound that both sides, having discovered it independently, kept it a secret, terrified the other side might use it first. The terror Oberfunker Hartmann experienced in the Stade Control Station was not unique. It was the physical manifestation of a symmetrical nightmare that had haunted high commands in both London and Berlin for more than a year. The technology that blinded the Kammhuber Line was not new. It was a secret so simple, so devastating, that both sides had independently discovered it and simultaneously classified it, terrified the other would deploy it first. The German version was known as Düppel. When tested, it had completely blinded German radar. Reichsmarshall Hermann Göring, upon witnessing the demonstration, did not order it into production. He banned all further research and ordered the reports locked away. Göring understood that Great Britain, having survived the Blitz, was far more dependent on its radar defense network, the chain home system, than Germany was. To use Düppel was to invite catastrophic retaliation against the Reich's own defenses. In Great Britain, the story was identical. In early 1942, a physicist at the Telecommunications research establishment, Joan Elizabeth Curran, developed the concept as part of Project Window. The urgency was clear. Allied bombers were being torn apart by the sophisticated German air defense network, but the solution Curran proposed was deemed too dangerous to use. The debate paralyzed Allied strategy. Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's influential scientific advisor, argued vehemently against its use. He was joined by the head of RAF Fighter Command and the Anti-Aircraft Command. Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, warned that if Germany retaliated, British cities would be left defenseless, repeating the horrors of the Blitz on an unimaginable scale. For 18 months, the most effective radar countermeasure ever devised sat on a shelf. For 18 months, the most effective radar countermeasure ever devised sat on a shelf. It was not a weapon, it was a mutual suicide pact. The genius of Window was its brutal simplicity. It was not a complex, 60-pound active jammer like the Carpet ANAPTT-2 system. It was physics in its most elegant form. The German air defense relied on two primary radar types. First was the Freya, an early warning system operating between 120–130 MHz, capable of detecting formations at a range of 160 kilometers. But the true killer was the Würzburg gun-laying radar. The Würzburg was precise, operating at 560 MHz with a range of 2940 km, and it guided both the flak batteries and the night fighters directly to their targets. Joan Curran's calculations targeted the Würzburg specifically. The Würzburg radar operated on a wavelength of 53 centimeters. Curran determined that thin strips of metal cut to half that wavelength, 27 centimeters, or 10.63 inches, would resonate perfectly, reflecting the 560 MHz signal and creating a false echo indistinguishable from a heavy bomber. The window strips themselves were primitive. They were 2-centimeter wide strips of aluminum foil laminated onto black paper, designed to flutter slowly as they fell, maximizing their screen time. They were packed into 1-pound bundles. The deployment plan was equally simple. Each aircraft in the bomber stream would drop 1 bundle per minute. When 791 aircraft did this simultaneously, as they did over Hamburg, the effect was exponential. A single bomber dropping 1 bundle per minute created thousands of false targets. An entire stream created millions. The Würzburg operators saw not 791 bombers, but a solid, advancing wall of radar echoes kilometers wide, rendering interception impossible. The paradox of window was that its greatest strength, its simplicity, was the source of Allied terror. What German pilots mistook for an incomprehensible electronic assault was, in fact, just paper and foil. The 18-month delay in its use gave the Germans a false sense of security. It was a delay that, as General Josef Kammhuber himself later admitted, proved critical. Had you introduced this 6 months earlier, Kammhuber stated post-war, German industry might have had time to develop and mass-produce radar sets operating on different frequencies, but by July 1943, Allied desperation had overcome Allied fear. The decision was made. The bomber losses were too high, and the Kammhuber Line had to be broken. The 18-month paralysis in Allied command, the agonizing debate that pitted strategic necessity against the terror of retaliation, finally broke in the summer of 1943. The cost of the air war had become mathematically unsustainable. RAF Bomber Command's losses were too high, the Kammhuber Line too effective. The decision, long deferred by men like Frederick Lindemann and Herbert Morrison, was made. Operation Gomorrah, the saturation bombing of Hamburg, would also be the combat debut of Window. The fear of German retaliation was now secondary to the necessity of breaking the Reich's defences. The night of July 24-25, 1943, Hamburg, Germany, 791 RAF bombers, Stirlings, Halifaxes and Lancasters, crossed the German coast. They were not just a bombing force, they were a vector for a new type of warfare. Inside each aircraft, crewmen stood by, ready to deploy the 1-pound bundles of 27-centimeter aluminum laminated paper strips at 1-minute intervals. On the ground, the operators of the Kammhuber Line settled in for a routine interception. Their Freya radars would acquire the formations at 160 kilometers. The precise Würzburg radar crews would then lock onto individual targets, guiding the flak batteries and vectoring the Luftwaffe's night fighters, Bf-110 Hares and U-88s, for the kill. The system was a marvel of German engineering, a deadly interlocking grid that had claimed hundreds of Allied aircraft. At 00:57 hours, the first window bundles were dropped. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. At the Stade Fighter Control Station, Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann watched his screen dissolve. Where seconds before there had been dozens of distinct trackable plots, there was now a solid, crawling mass of green light. The system was reporting thousands of aircraft. The noise on the RT net descended into chaos. Controllers, utterly blinded, were shouting contradictory vectors. Night fighter pilots, orbiting in the darkness, saw only empty sky where their radar claimed an entire air armada existed. The statistical result of Operation Gomorrah was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Of the 791 bombers that attacked Hamburg, only 12 were lost. This was a loss rate of just 1.5%. The Kammhuber Line, which had boasted interception rates approaching 16%, had been rendered completely inert. The bombers flew their routes with an impunity that German controllers had believed impossible. The city of Hamburg burned. There was no mystery in the German High Command. The analysis was immediate and terrifying. The British had deployed Düppel, Dr. Sishin Wing the Mnemonic Foundation. Hans Pendel, a key German scientist, summarized the realization. The British had deployed Düppel, the identical radar countermeasure that German scientists had developed, but never used for fear of retaliation. The very weapon Hermann Göring had banned in 1942, fearing its effect on his own defenses, was now being used against him. The realization on the front lines was one of pure technological impotence. We had been rendered blind by some technology we did not understand and could not counter. Klaus Hartmann wrote in his after-action report, he had not yet been briefed on the existence of Düppel. All he knew was the result. We had become useless overnight. What German analysis had failed to appreciate was not the technology, but the philosophy. Göring had banned Düppel based on a symmetrical assumption that because Germany was vulnerable, Britain was equally vulnerable, and therefore neither side would dare use it. It was the logic of deterrence. They failed to calculate that the Allies, facing unsustainable bomber losses, would eventually reach a breaking point where the risk of retaliation was preferable to the certainty of strategic defeat. Germany had prioritized the defense of its homeland radar. The Allies prioritized the success of their offensive bombing campaign. The interpretation from Hamburg circulated through the High Command not as a tactical note, but as a strategic crisis. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, met with Hitler days later. The implications were clear. Hamburg put the fear of God in me, Speer later wrote. He recognized that this simple, cheap countermeasure was not just a radar-blinding tool. It was a weapon capable of neutralizing the entire industrial Reich. Speer admitted a series of attacks of this sort would bring German armaments production to a halt. The German response was now a desperate race against time. They had to find a counter to their own invention, but window was physics, and physics could not be easily fooled. The Allies, having finally overcome 18 months of hesitation, now held the electronic key to the Reich. The Battle of the Beans had ended. The war on the German night sky had entered a new devastating phase. The strategic implications of the Hamburg raid were not fully understood by the Allied crews who returned to England on the morning of July 25, 1943. For them it was a mission with impossibly low casualties. For the German High Command it was the moment the war was strategically lost. The turning point was not a single aircraft surviving impossible damage. It was an entire multi-billion Reichsmark defense system suffering a total, instantaneous and impossible death. The event unfolded not over 15 minutes but over 150. It began at 00:57 hours. In the main fighter control room for the Kammhuber Line, the air was thick with the routine tension of a massed bomber raid. General Josef Kammhuber, the brilliant architect of the system, had absolute confidence in his interlocking grid of Freya and Würzburg radars. The General Josef Kammhuber, the brilliant architect of the system, had absolute confidence in his interlocking grid of Freya and Würzburg radars. His operators were veterans, his night fighter pilots the elite of the Luftwaffe. Then the reports began. First, from the Stade station, Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann, his voice tight with disbelief, reported thousands of signals. His console was a solid, unusable mass of light. The operations officer dismissed it. Equipment failure, Hartmann. Reboot your system. This cannot be real, Hartmann. Reboot your system. This cannot be real, Hartmann insisted. Seconds later, the next station along the bomber path reported the same phenomenon. Then the next, Tridni Deloading for Night Bomberkampf, reported the same phenomenon. Then the next, and the next. Within 5 minutes, every single Würzburg and Freya radar set from the coast to Hamburg was reporting an identical catastrophic failure. This was not an equipment fault. This was an attack. In the skies above, the veteran night fighter pilots of Nachtjagdgeschwader 3 were vectored to intercepts that did not exist. Their own on-board Lichtenstein radars, operating on the same frequency, were also blinded, showing dozens of targets for every real bomber. Pilots dove on clouds of aluminum foil, firing 20mm cannons into empty air, their tracers vanishing into the darkness. They orbited in frustration, hearing the phantom echoes on their systems, while the audio of their ground controllers descended from crisp commands into raw panic. On the ground, the flak commanders of Hamburg faced the same nightmare. Their Würzburg gun-laying radars, designed to place an 88mm shell within a 30-meter box at 20,000 feet, were now useless. They saw thousands of targets, a statistical impossibility. They were forced to revert to primitive box barrage firing, throwing shells blindly into the sky, hoping for a random impact. The reports flooding Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin were incomprehensible. From 16% effectiveness, the Kammhuber Line had dropped to 0% effectiveness. In 20 minutes, an entire strategic weapon, the shield of the Reich, had been neutralized by what radar scientists confirmed hours later was Düppel, the very technology Göring had ordered banned. The Allies, it seemed, had no such fear. The full weight of this impossible event did not land on the radar operators. It landed on one man, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production. Speer's multiplication was not a series of individual aircraft surviving. It was the multiplication of Hamburg. As the reports of the firestorm and the city's destruction piled on his desk, he saw a pattern that terrified him. This was not a tactical loss, it was a strategic apocalypse. The 1.5% loss rate for the RAF meant the Allies could and would do this again, and again, and again, and again. Hamburg put the fear of God in me, Speer admitted in his post-war analysis. He understood the mathematics of attrition. The Allies had used 791 bombers. They had thousands. Germany had 12 major industrial cities. If the Allies repeated this attack just a dozen times, the war was over. Speer immediately recognized that window was not a counter to radar. It was a counter to German industry. He calculated the consequences with cold precision. A series of attacks of this sort, he concluded, would bring German armaments production to a halt. The multiplication was the realization that every German city was now defenseless. Every Krupp steel works, every Messerschmitt factory, every U-boat pen was now as vulnerable as Hamburg. The technological shield that had allowed Speer to build his industrial miracle was gone, shattered by one-pound bundles of paper and foil. The German recognition was immediate, formal and desperate. Within 48 hours, an emergency conference was convened, bringing together Luftwaffe Command, radar engineers and scientists, including Dr. Hans Pendel. The mood was not analytical, it was funereal. Dr. Pendel's assessment was clinical. The British had deployed Düppel, the identical radar countermeasure that German scientists had developed, but never used for fear of retaliation. There was no debate. The evidence was burning in the streets of Hamburg. The analysis was simple. Every radar set in Germany operating on the 53-centimeter wavelength was now obsolete. This included thousands of Würzburg sets, the entire night fighter control network, and the primary flak defense system. The tactical implications were clear. The night fighters were blind. The guns were blind. The Reich was blind. The only solution was to build an entirely new radar infrastructure based on new frequencies. A task that would take years Germany did not have. The Battle of the Beams was over, and Germany had lost. The catastrophic blinding of the Kammhuber Line during the night of July 24–25, 1943 was not a singular event. It was the first shot in a relentless systematic campaign that would prove the German defenses were not just vulnerable, but permanently broken. What Oberfunker Hartmann and Albert Speer had recognized in a single night of terror would be demonstrated with mathematical brutality, again and again as Allied domination of the electronic spectrum became absolute. July 24–25, 1943, Hamburg, 791 RAF bombers initiated Operation Gomorrah, deploying window en masse for the first time. The Kammhuber Line was totally blinded. German controllers saw only a solid wall of false echoes. The result was a strategic catastrophe. 2,284 tons of ordnance were dropped for a loss of only 12 bombers, a 1.5% loss rate. A German controller at the Stade Fighter Control Station transmitted in panic, "There are bombers everywhere. It is impossible to direct fighters to specific targets." July 25, 1943, Hamburg. The USAAF immediately exploited the breach, sending daylight sorties to maintain 24-hour pressure. The German defences were in chaos, but the American raid had limited effectiveness. The reason was not German flak or fighters, but the smoke. The target was completely obscured by the still raging fires from the previous night, a new form of blindness created by the indefensible RAF attack, proving the city's defences were broken. July 27–28, 1943, Hamburg. The RAF returned at night with 787 bombers. Window was deployed again, and again the German defences were useless. The bombing concentration was so precise and undefended that it triggered a catastrophic firestorm. The inferno reached 800 degrees Celsius with 150 mph winds, incinerating 21 square kilometers and killing over 42,000 people. This was the direct physical consequence of neutralized radar. July 29–30, 1943, Hamburg. A third night raid struck the shattered city. Window again rendered the Würzburg network inert. German controllers, with no radar to guide them, became desperate. They began vectoring fighters directly into the bomber stream using only a running radio commentary, ordering experienced pilots to find targets visually in the searchlights and flames. This improvised Wilde Sau Wild Boar tactic was born of pure technological desperation. August 2–3, 1943, Hamburg. The final major raid of Operation Gomorrah sealed the city's fate. By the time the last bomber turned for home, 50% of Germany's second-largest city was classified as destroyed or damaged. The Kammhuber Line, the Reich's multi-billion Reichsmark technological shield, had been systematically defeated in less than 10 days by 1-pound bundles of aluminum foil. Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann's report was bleak. We had been rendered blind. July 3–4, 1943, Cologne. The desperate Wilde Sau tactic was not entirely new. Instantaneous Line. The desperate Wilde Sau tactic was not entirely new. In an engagement just weeks before Hamburg, German day fighters had experimented with visual night interception over Cologne, shooting down 30 British aircraft. This single, earlier success dependent on pilot skill and visibility, not radar, was the only doctrine the Luftwaffe could fall back on when Window blinded their primary system. It was a regression to 1918-style warfare. The Allies, having seized the electronic initiative, did not remain static. Window was just the beginning. The USAAF daylight sorties on July 25th and 26th during Gomorrah signaled a new 24-hour strategic pressure, forcing German defences to operate without rest. But the true evolution was adding active jamming to the passive window reflectors. In October 1943, the carpet jammer system, the ANAPTT-2, was deployed. This was not a passive reflector, it was an active jammer, a 60-pound system that broadcast electronic noise, specifically targeting the German Würzburg frequencies. By late 1944, with over 14,000 units produced, it became standard for 2 ANAPTT-2 jammers to be carried per bomber, supplementing Window and ensuring that any German radar that wasn't blinded by false echoes would be deafened by a blanket of electronic chaos. The German response was immediate and desperate, a cycle of futility that drained the Reich of its most precious resources. The first countermeasure was Wilde Sau Wild Boar. This tactic, rushed into service, used single-engine day fighters FW-190S and Bf-109S and Bf-10 for visual interception, guided only by radio commentary. It had initial successes but was entirely dependent on clear weather and was suicidally dangerous for pilots. It was abandoned by the spring of 1944 as unsustainable. Next came Zahme Sau, term Boar. This was a more successful evolution, using twin-engine night fighters directed by a running commentary from a central controller who collated reports from the few radar stations still able to find gaps in the jamming. It was a marginally effective manpower-intensive stopgap, but still reliant on glimpses of data in an ocean of noise. The only true solution was new technology. German engineers raced to develop the Lichtenstein SN-2 radar, which operated on a new VHF band 158–187 MHz, immune to the 27-centimeter window strips. but it was rushed into service in late 1943, and the Allies quickly adapted their window lengths and carpet frequencies to jam it too. The effort to counter window diverted over 7,000 of Germany's top radar and electronics experts for 18 months, a strategic brain drain Germany could not afford. The psychological impact on the German High Command was absolute. Albert Speer's fear of God was not hyperbole, it was a cold economic calculation. He reported to Hitler that 6 more raids on the scale of Hamburg could force Germany out of the war. Luftwaffe operators, like Klaus Hartmann, felt useless overnight. The shock was not just that the system had failed, but that it had been defeated so completely, so simply, and so irreversibly. By August 1943, the systematic destruction of Hamburg had proven that window was not just a tactical gadget. It was a strategic weapon of the highest order. The tactical dominance achieved in 10 days transformed into a strategic revolution, forcing the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe to fundamentally restructure the entire air defense of the Reich. Between July 1943 and the end of the war, the Luftwaffe would be forced to abandon its primary defensive doctrine, reallocate thousands of its best technical minds, and implement desperate improvised tactics, changes documented in after-action reports that revealed a dawning recognition of their technological impotence. The first and most immediate doctrinal change was the total abandonment of the Kammhuber Line. This intricate, rigid box defense system, which relied on thousands of Würzburg radars guiding individual night fighters to targets in specific zones, was rendered useless. Window did not just degrade the Kammhuber Line, it deleted it. German High Command was forced to accept overnight that its multi-billion Reichsmark investment was obsolete. In its place, German command adopted Wilde Sau and Zahme Sau. These were not doctrines of technological superiority, they were doctrines of desperation. Wilde Sau bore through experienced day fighters, lacking on-board radar, into the night bomber streams, relying on searchlights, target indicators, and the fires of the cities below for visual acquisition. Zahme Sau was slightly more sophisticated, using twin-engine fighters guided by a running radio commentary from a central controller who tried to find gaps in the Allied jamming. Both tactics were a regression, replacing precision radar interception with chaotic, manpower-intensive visual brawls. On the Allied side, the impact was equally profound. The success of Operation Gomorrah shattered 18 months of institutional fear. On July 15, 1943, before the Hamburg raid, RAF Command had finally authorized the full-scale deployment of Window, accepting the risk of German retaliation. After Hamburg, this authorization became a core component of all future strategic bombing. Electronic warfare, once a feared concept, was now the indispensable spearhead of the air war. The strategic impact was immediate, redrawing the map of the air war over Europe. The most significant campaign affected was, of course, Operation Gomorrah itself. From late July to early August 1943, the combination of window and massed bombing proved its devastating effectiveness. It resulted in the near-total destruction of Hamburg and the deaths of over 42,000 people, mostly civilians. It was a terrifying demonstration that Allied bombers could now strike German industrial centers with relative impunity, a feat impossible just 1 week prior. This victory was predicated on the collapse of the Kammhuber Line. From July 1943 onwards, Germany's primary air defense networks ceased to be a factor. The strategic implication was that the entirety of the Reich was now open. There was no longer a fortified wall. The Allies could route their bombers wherever they chose, forcing the depleted Luftwaffe to scramble and react, rather than intercepting from prepared positions. This new reality defined the Battle of Berlin, which raged from November 1943 to March 1944. RAF Command, now fully committed to electronic warfare, used window and the newly deployed carpet active jammers on every raid. The Luftwaffe, forced to rely on its Sau tactics and the rushed deployment of the new Lichtenstein SN-2 radar, which operated on a different frequency, found itself in a desperate technological race. But the Allies were now adapting faster than the Germans, dropping new window strips cut for the SN-2's frequency, creating a relentless cycle of measure and countermeasure that the German industrial base could not sustain. Post-war analysis and captured documents revealed that German High Command understood the implications immediately. Allied intelligence reports, summarized by R.V. Jones in 1947, noted that the Germans, who referred to the strips as Hamburg bodies, felt that in a window war they would lose more than they would gain. This confirmed the entire basis of the 18-month Allied hesitation. A Luftwaffe technical staff report was even more direct. German scientists knew exactly what they were, Düppel, but had refrained from using it for the same reasons as the British. They had been defeated by their own suppressed invention. The most damning recognition came from the heart of the Reich's war machine. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, was unequivocal about the raid that window made possible. Hamburg put the fear of God in me, he wrote, stating that a handful of similar raids, sustained over weeks, would have brought all German armaments production to a definitive halt. Hitler himself, upon hearing the reports, expressed fear that such raids could force Germany out of the war. The mathematics of this new industrial electronic warfare were hopelessly skewed. The cost of window was negligible, less than 1 penny sterling per strip. The Allies could produce it in infinite quantities. They also mass-produced active jammers, rolling out over 14,000 carpet and APTT-2 systems. The German cost, in contrast, was catastrophic. It was not a cost paid in Reichsmarks, but in irreplaceable human capital. To counter window and the subsequent Allied electronic measures, Germany was forced to divert over 7,000 of its top radar and electronics experts. For 18 months from mid-1943 until the end of the war, this brain trust was pulled away from developing offensive weapons, jet engines, and advanced U-boats. They were consumed by a purely defensive, reactive, and ultimately futile task, trying to find a way to see in the electronic darkness the Allies had created. It was a strategic diversion of resources that sealed the technological fate of the Reich. By the spring of 1944, the strategic diversion of 7,000 of Germany's best technical minds to counter window had permanently crippled the Reich's offensive research. The tactical victories of 1943 had transformed into an irreversible strategic collapse. The tactical victories of 1943 had transformed into an irreversible strategic collapse. But the final statistics reveal a scale of disparity that strategic analysis alone cannot capture. Between July 1943 and May 1945, a simple piece of aluminum foil, costing less than 1 penny sterling per strip, produced a mathematical imbalance that redefined air warfare. The numbers document a near-perfect reversal of fortune. Production and cost. The cost of window was negligible, yet its impact was astronomical. The 100-plus tons of window dropped during a major night raid cost less than a single heavy bomber, yet saved dozens. German operational collapse. Before July 24, 1943, the Kammhuber Line achieved a routine interception rate of 16%. In the first week of window deployment, that rate fell to 0. The combined use of window and the active carpet jammers resulted in an immediate 75% reduction in the effectiveness of German anti-aircraft flak batteries. Flak caused bomber losses, which had been a steady 2.5% of the attacking force, plummeted, stabilizing between 0.4% and 0.6%. Allied operational gain. The contrast in Allied survival was just as stark. The RAF's typical, often unsustainable loss rate of 5% to 6% per mission dropped to just 1.5% during Operation Gomorrah. Operation Gomorrah. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later calculated that the combined effect of window and carpet jamming saved the lives of more than 4,500 Allied aircrewmen. Post-war recognition documented in technical debriefs confirmed the universality of the German shock. There were no post-war reunions between the blinded German radar operators and the Allied aircrews. The connection was not personal, but purely technological. The admission of defeat was clinical. Klaus Hartmann, the operator at the Stade Station, who first witnessed the electronic blizzard, provided the definitive summary in his post-war testimony. "We had been rendered blind," he stated, recounting the chaos of that night. We had become useless overnight. This admission was not hyperbole. It was the after-action report of an entire defense network that had ceased to exist. A captured Luftwaffe technical staff report was equally blunt. German scientists knew exactly what they were, Düppel, but had refrained from using it for the same reasons as the British. They had been beaten by their own symmetrical fear. The legacy of Window extended far beyond the 1945 victory. It became a fundamental pillar of all modern military doctrine. Chaff remains a standard, non-negotiable electronic warfare countermeasure in every modern air force in 2025. The basic physics developed by Joan Elizabeth Curran, cutting metallic dipoles to the half-wavelength of the target radar, remains the foundation of modern passive electronic countermeasures. This concept led directly to the NATO standardization of chaff and flare deployment systems that protect virtually all Western military aircraft. This technical legacy, however, was built on the foundation of human courage. The vital intelligence on the Würzburg radar was gathered at extreme risk. Men like Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Beschennings, Mithiginkels at Habelshi Beschindi Beschenningel Modi Tabula Massive some Warden Rapalmfaring. Cox, a radar technician who volunteered for the 1942 Bruneval raid, parachuted into occupied France to dismantle and retrieve the key German radar components. R.V. Jones, who oversaw the intelligence that made Window possible, recounted Cox's humble response upon being congratulated for his heroism. "I can stand a lot of kindness, sir." It was this quiet technical bravery that provided the data for Curran's revolutionary, yet profoundly simple design. The story of Window transcends the Second World War. It reveals a universal and terrifying principle about technological warfare, that the most decisive weapon is not always the most complex or the most expensive. The Battle of the Beams was a victory of physics over concrete, of intelligence over infrastructure. It proved that symmetrical fear, the assumption that an enemy will not use a weapon because you also possess it, is the most fragile basis for strategy. It is a logic that holds only until one side calculates that the cost of inaction has become greater than the fear of retaliation. This is the final truth Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann confronted at the Stade station. He sat before the most advanced air defense system in the world, a line that had achieved a 16% kill rate. He then watched that rate fall to zero. The thousands of signals he saw were not, as his instinct first suggested, a new form of warfare. They were deception, one of warfare's oldest forms enabled by physics. His training insisted it was equipment failure. What it was the end of his war. "This cannot be real," he had reported, but it was, and it had rendered an empire blind,